Pawn advances to d4, immediately establishes central influence, and opens diagonal lines for bishops. Developing a knight towards the center anticipates potential pawn structures and prepares for queenside castling. Securing central space and opening diagonals for queenside development. Pawning the king's flank signals intent to fianchetto, a classic Kings-Indian or Grunfeld setup, potentially leading to dynamic, unbalanced positions. Solidifying the center and preparing to expand queenside pressure. The fianchettoed bishop now eyes the long diagonal, preparing for central influence and potential queenside pressure. Asserting central space dramatically opens diagonals, preparing for an attacking pawn storm. Solidifying the center, black prepares for a fianchetto defense, aiming to control the long diagonal with the bishop. Solidifying the center's pawn structure and preparing for queenside castling, knight development continues harmoniously. Securing the monarch away from the central storm, this move prioritizes king safety, a foundational element in Kings-Indian structures. Preparing to support the central pawn advance, this bishop now aims its gaze toward the king side. Challenging the center immediately, black seeks dynamic play and opens lines for their pieces. Securing the king's safety initiates the central struggle for control of the d5 square. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Pushing the pawn forward aggressively claims central territory, intending to cramp black's position and potentially prepare a kingside attack. Steering the knight towards the kingside opens avenues for future pawn advances and potential knight outposts. Securing the knight on its advanced square, white aims to prepare the central pawn push, potentially opening lines towards black's kingside. Initiating flank expansion, this move aims to seize queenside space and potentially dislodge white's knight from its central outpost. Securing the queenside pawn structure offers a stable foundation for future queenside expansion. Shattering central pawn symmetry creates dynamic counterplay, but risks weakening the queenside structure. Securing the b-file now prepares for a potential queenside expansion, leveraging the rook's activity. This knight retreat, while seemingly passive, repositions the piece to contest the d5 stronghold and prepare for potential breakthroughs on the queenside. Cracking open the queenside is the immediate goal, creating new avenues for attack and disrupting black's pawn structure. Shattering the pawn chain, black immediately seeks counterplay and aims to open lines for their rook and potentially activate the knight. Opening the a-file with this pawn recapture immediately unlocks lines of attack and forces black to confront the exposed queenside. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing a retreat for the knight anchors the queenside defense. Opening the b-file suddenly injects immediate tactical dynamism into this typically closed Kings-Indian setup. Embracing a fractured pawn structure to unlock the b-file is a bold choice, seeking counterplay despite the inherent weaknesses. Pressuring the center and preparing to expand on the queenside are the key ideas behind this knight repositioning. Securing the king behind pawns signals a desire for central stability, while allowing defenders to redeploy. Sharpening the light square influence and preparing to challenge the central pawn chain with a future f4 push. Reassessing knight placement, black repositions to c7, preparing for an eventual fianchetto or even a surprising g5 push to undermine white's pawn chain. Initiating pressure along the open file, aiming to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain. Abandoning the rook allows white undisputed control of the a-file, creating immense pressure on the queenside and a dangerous open path towards black's king. Reclaiming the queen, white eyes the central light squares and prepares to unleash pressure along the file. Aggressively challenging the center, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's solid structure and open lines for black's pieces. Injecting mobility onto the knight, this maneuver eyes the weakened dark squares and prepares to infiltrate enemy territory. Reclaiming the f6 square shores up your central structure, preparing to challenge white's rook on the open file. A daring outpost established, aiming to suffocate black's queenside mobility and threaten the vulnerable f-pawn. Focusing the queen on the king side for a potential attack, but the queen side still looks vulnerable. Unlocking the central tension, this pawn sacrifice aims to shatter black's kingside pawn structure, potentially exposing the king to tactical threats. Opening the g-file for the rook creates immediate dynamic possibilities, forcing white to calculate carefully. The queen boldly probes the weakened kingside, threatening a swift checkmate sequence. Repositioning the bishop to an open diagonal, seeking activity and potential pressure on white's queenside pawns while avoiding immediate confrontation. Liberating the bishop opens lines, immediately targeting black's exposed king and creating a dangerous passed pawn threat on the queen side. Reactivating the knight to contest the open file injects much-needed counterplay into black's constricted position. Reinforcing the kingside attack with the rook's new influence on the central open file presents a direct challenge. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, this gambit boldly opens critical lines, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces before they can fully solidify. This bishop's repositioning aims to bolster the center and prepare for potential advances, while also eyeing the now exposed black monarch. Liberating the bishop from the diagonal, black seeks active counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure. Clearing the file for the rook grants a crucial open pathway, creating dynamic threats and potentially exploiting black's exposed monarch. Developing the bishop to f5 activates a latent diagonal, potentially targeting white's centralized king and creating dynamic counterplay. A strategic retreat to bolster the king's defense and prepare for future central operations. Reasserting presence, the bishop aims to enliven the queenside and contest the open file. Repositioning the knight to g4 offers attacking chances, potentially targeting weaknesses around black's king. Reigniting the attack on the d-file offers new attacking avenues. Reinforcing the d4 pawn, preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm and solidifying white's central structure. Challenging central control, this pawn push injects immediate dynamic potential, forcing a reevaluation of white's king safety and piece harmony. Liberating the d-file opens up attacking avenues, but watch for counterplay on the queen side. Reclaiming central influence, this knight now targets vulnerable squares and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure. Reinforcing the bishop on d3 solidifies white's queenside presence and prepares a potential knight jump to c7. Unleashing the knight into enemy territory creates immediate tactical questions about white's king safety and piece activity. Capturing that knight offers a favorable exchange, simplifying into a winning endgame with clear material advantage. Liberating the knight opens new avenues, potentially targeting white's isolated pawns and forcing a reassessment of its defensive structure. Suddenly, the knight's daring dive opens a dangerous diagonal for white's pieces. Sacrificing the bishop for a pawn opens up the dark squares for your rook to exploit. Reclaiming that outpost for the knight now looks strategically paramount. A desperate attempt to create a passed pawn, but it leaves the king incredibly exposed. A calculated sacrifice to open the king's flight path and unleash mating threats. Relinquishing the immediate check opens a new tactical avenue, forcing a careful retreat to safeguard the exposed monarch. Forces the black king into a critical net, exposing it to immediate mating threats across the ranks. The black king finds a temporary refuge, yet the looming threats on the central files are far from neutralized. Exposing the black king with a dazzling knight sacrifice forces mate. Repeating the king's position might be a trap, or perhaps black hopes white will overextend and lose material. Securing the central d-pawn opens lines for your remaining rook to rejoin the battle. A bold sacrifice attempts to disrupt the white king's safety. King's safety is now paramount as the white monarch steps into a perilous central position. Sacrificing the rook clears a path, forcing the king into a dangerous central position and opening the critical f-file for attack. Recapturing the rook initiates a simplified endgame, where white's king will become active to support the passed pawn. The king's exposed position finally succumbs to the relentless pressure on the open file. The white king bravely steps into the fray, a bold sacrifice to clear the path for the remaining pawns. The bishop's retreat to f1 finally reestablishes a defense for your isolated kingside pawns, unlocking the knight's potential to dominate the queenside and harass the isolated bishop. Recapturing the pawn strengthens black's central pawn mass, creating an active outpost for the bishop and simplifying towards a drawn endgame. A calculated risk to infiltrate the pawn's structure and disrupt black's coordination. Activating the bishop for a decisive endgame pawn, storm against the exposed white king. The monarch's exposed position on the kingside now becomes a significant vulnerability for black. Black's bishop reclaims its active post, aiming to disrupt white's rook's dominance on the open file. Reclaiming the central square creates a mating net, forcing black's king into a perilous corner. This pawn push aims to create immediate mating threats by opening lines towards white's uncastled king. Pushing the pawn forward injects a dose of positional venom, threatening to unravel black's defensive structure and open vital lines.